Every single morning for 365 days, Clara Whitfield heard the steady rhythm of hooves on the dry, packed earth of the trail that ran alongside her property line. And every single morning she told herself she would not look up from her work. And every single morning she looked up anyway. The year was 1878, and the territory of Kansas was still a wild and unforgiving place, where the wind carried dust from one end of the horizon to the other, where the grass bent low under the weight of summer heat, and where a woman alone on a homestead was considered either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, depending on who you asked. Clara Whitfield was neither asking nor caring about other people's opinions. She was too busy surviving. She had come to this particular stretch of land 2 years prior, following her husband Thomas Whitfield, who had pulled her west with promises of fertile soil and honest work, and a life built by their own 2 hands. Thomas had been a good man in the way that so many good men were good, which was to say he had meant well, he had worked hard, and he had died before any of the promises had fully bloomed. A fever took him in the autumn of 1876, barely 14 months after they had driven their wagon stakes into this particular piece of Kansas earth. He left Clara with 40 acres, a broken pump, a mule named Gerald who had opinions about nearly everything, and a daughter named Me who was 3 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw. Clara had considered going back east. She had stood in front of Thomas's grave, which she had dug herself with blistered hands and a grief so wide and dark she could barely see across it, and she had considered it seriously. She had thought about her sister in Ohio, about the boarding house her mother ran in Columbus, about the relative comfort of a life that did not require her to coax reluctant corn out of Kansas soil. She had thought about all of it, and then she had gone inside and made me a bowl of porridge and decided that Thomas had believed in this land, and so she would believe in it too, at least long enough to find out if it was worth believing in. By the spring of 1878, she had gotten the pump working with help from old Reverend Davies, who turned out to be more useful with a wrench than with scripture. She had planted a kitchen garden that was actually producing. She had bartered herself into a small flock of chickens and 2 goats she had named Harriet and Bess, after suffragettes she had read about in a pamphlet that a traveling woman had left behind at the general store in the town of Grover's Creek, which was 4 miles east and served as the closest thing Clara had to civilization. The farm was not prosperous, not by any stretch of anyone's imagination, but it was alive, and Clara Whitfield was keeping it that way. The trail that ran along her property line connected the town of Grover's Creek to the larger cattle operation owned by the Aldridge family, whose spread sat about 6 miles to the west. The Aldridges ran several hundred head of cattle and employed a rotating roster of cowboys and ranch hands who came and went with the seasons. Clara had met old Edmund Aldridge once at the general store and found him to be polite in the stiff way that wealthy men are polite to women they consider to be a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. It was one of the Aldridge cowboys who rode past her farm every morning. She noticed him first in the early days of April, when the sky was still deciding whether it wanted to be winter or spring, and the mornings had a bite to them that kept your breath visible until nearly 9 o'clock. He came from the direction of Grover's Creek, always from the east, always at roughly the same hour, just as the sun was pulling itself above the flat horizon and painting everything amber and rose. He rode a bay horse, dark reddish-brown with a black mane, solid and well-muscled, the kind of horse that suggested someone had spent real money or real time, possibly both. He wore a dark hat, pulled low, and a canvas jacket in the colder months that gave way to a plain cotton shirt as the weather warmed. He never stopped, he never even slowed. He rode past at a steady, easy trot, the horse moving with the relaxed confidence of an animal that had made this trip many times and saw no reason to be dramatic about it. The cowboy himself sat easy in the saddle, the natural boneless posture of a man who had spent so much of his life on horseback that sitting on a horse felt more natural to him than sitting in a chair. Clara noticed all of this while pretending not to notice any of it. The first week, she told herself, she was simply cataloging the local traffic in the responsible way that a woman alone should know who was moving through her vicinity. The second week, she acknowledged to herself that she had started timing her morning chores so that she was in the yard or near the fence line when he passed. By the third week, she stopped making excuses and simply watched, the way you watch something that is beautiful and does not know it is being watched. He was handsome, though she did not dwell on this with any particular urgency. She was 26 years old, a widow with a small child, and romance felt like something that belonged to a version of herself she had packed away when she packed Thomas into the ground. She was aware of the handsomeness the way she was aware of the sunset, as something real and present in the world that she appreciated without feeling entitled to possess. Me, who was 4 by the spring of 1878 and had developed strong opinions about everything, noticed him too. "The horseman," she announced one morning in late April, pointing with the directness that small children have not yet learned to temper into something socially acceptable. "Do not point," Clara said automatically. "The horseman is going again," Me said, keeping her small finger extended with conviction. "He works for the Aldridge Ranch," Clara said, as if this explained everything, which in her own mind it did. He was an Aldridge man. She was a homesteader widow with 40 acres and a broken heart still in the process of mending. He was the kind of person who passed through. She was the kind of person who stayed. She did not know his name. Summer arrived in Kansas with the usual lack of subtlety, throwing heat at the land like a punishment. The corn that Clara had planted in her Maine field struggled in the dry July heat, and she spent long days hauling water from the pump to the field, bucket by bucket, a task that was both exhausting and futile feeling, though she refused to let herself feel futile for very long because futility was a luxury she could not afford. Me helped in the way that 4-year-olds help, which is to say she handed Clara things that Clara had not asked for and asked questions at a rate that would have exhausted a less devoted mother. Through all of July and into August, he kept riding past. Sometimes Clara was in the field and she would straighten from her work and watch him for the few seconds it took him to cross her line of sight, a dark shape against the blazing white sky, moving with that same unhurried rhythm. Once in mid-July, she was at the fence with Gerald the mule, trying to convince Gerald to cooperate with a harness adjustment, and the cowboy passed so close that she could have called out to him without raising her voice. She did not call out. Gerald chose that moment to be particularly uncooperative, and by the time she had the mule sorted, the cowboy was already a shrinking figure on the trail. There were things about the trail she could observe. He always rode in the morning, eastward to Grover's Creek, and he always came back in the afternoon, westward toward the Aldridge Ranch. Sometimes he carried supplies tied to the back of his saddle. Once she saw him with a wooden crate balanced across his thighs with the careful posture of a man determined not to let something fragile shatter. She wondered what was in the crate. She decided it was probably something practical and boring like harness hardware, and she felt slightly disappointed by her own sensible conclusion. In August, a drought settled over the county like a death sentence. The pump began to give less water than she needed. Her kitchen garden started to shrivel. The corn, already struggling, gave up entirely in 2 of the 3 rows. Clara spent a week making hard calculations at her kitchen table by lamplight while Me slept in the small room at the back of the house, and the numbers were not encouraging. She could sell the goats, though she hated the idea. She could take in sewing work, which Mrs. Eliza Porter in Grover's Creek had offered once, and which Clara had declined out of a pride she now recognized as having been somewhat impractical. She made trips to Grover's Creek to sell eggs and whatever produce she could spare, driving the wagon with Gerald pulling it with the resigned dignity of a mule who has accepted his lot. On one such trip in late August, she overheard 2 men talking at the feed store about the Aldridge Ranch, and she listened while pretending to study a rack of seed packets. Aldridge brought on a new trail manager back in spring, one of the men said. Fellow named Calloway, Eli Calloway, knows cattle better than most men know their own wives. Where's he from? The other man asked. Texas, originally. Did a stretch of trail work in Wyoming before Aldridge hired him on. Clara studied the seed packets with great attention. Eli Calloway. She turned the name over in her mind like a smooth stone, feeling its shape. She did not know if Eli Calloway was the man on the bay horse, but something in the way the men spoke about him, with the particular respect that practical men reserve for other practical men who have proven themselves, made her think it likely. She bought her seed and drove home and said nothing to me about any of it, because me was 4 and did not need to know that her mother had been secretly cataloging the name of a man who rode past their property and did not stop. September brought a change in the air, the first whisper of autumn threading through the heat like a rumor. The drought broke in the second week of the month with 3 days of steady soaking rain that filled the creek that ran along the north edge of Clara's property and redeemed what was left of her kitchen garden. She stood in the rain on the second morning of it and let it soak her completely, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. He still rode past. She watched him from the doorway during the rain, a figure in a dark slicker moving through the gray curtain of water, the bay horse's hooves making a different, thicker sound in the mud. He did not look toward the farm. He rarely did. Once or twice over the months she had thought his head had turned slightly in her direction, just the smallest angle, but she could never be certain from the distance whether she was seeing something real or simply hoping. October came, and with it the color in the trees along the creek, which were mostly cottonwoods and a few elms that turned the whole northern edge of her property a bright and trembling gold. The mornings grew cold enough that her breath made clouds again. She put me in warmer clothes and watched her daughter chase the chickens around the yard, with a seriousness of purpose that me brought to all her activities. Clara was 26, and she had not had an adult conversation that was not about commerce or practicalities in longer than she could clearly remember. She had Mrs. Porter in town, who was kind if slightly overwhelming, and she had Reverend Davies, who was helpful with pumps and awkward with everything else. She had the Hendersons on the farm 2 miles south, a family with 6 children and not much time for visiting, though they were good neighbors in the practical sense that they came when someone needed help. She had me, who was her whole heart, and she had the memory of Thomas, which was a different thing from having Thomas. She was lonely. She had spent a long time refusing to say that word, even in the privacy of her own thoughts, because loneliness felt like a complaint, and she did not have time for complaints. But in the long October evenings when me was asleep, and the wind moved around the corners of the house making its low, persistent sound, she sat at her kitchen table with her mending or her accounts, and she felt the loneliness the way you feel a healed scar, not the sharp pain of the original wound, but the permanent changed shape of the place where the wound had been. November arrived with the first hard frost, and Clara braced herself for winter. She had laid in a reasonable supply of firewood, helped by the Henderson boys who had come in exchange for 3 jars of her gooseberry preserves. She had put up vegetables and dried herbs, and the beef jerky she had made from a quarter of a steer she had purchased from the Hendersons at a fair price. She was as prepared as she could be, which she knew from experience meant she was probably underprepared in ways she had not thought of yet. He still rode past. Even in November, even in the mornings when the ground was iron-hard and the sky was the color of pewter, she heard the hooves on the trail, and she looked up from her work and she watched him pass. He wore a heavy coat now, dark wool, and his hat was pulled low against the wind. The bay horse moved steadily, untroubled by the cold. Man and horse together were a single shape against the winter landscape, moving through the world with a self-contained purposefulness that Clara found both admirable and, if she was honest, slightly maddening. Why did he never stop? She was aware that this was an unfair question. He had no reason to stop. She was a stranger to him. He was riding to work. He was a working man with places to be and tasks to accomplish, not a character in a story who was required to notice her. She knew all of this. She still thought the question. December was hard. The cold came down from the north with the full weight of a Kansas winter, which was a particular kind of brutal that showed no interest in being fair about it. One morning me woke with a cough that Clara watched carefully for 3 days before it resolved into nothing worse than a mild cold, during which 3 days Clara did not sleep much and prayed more than she typically admitted to doing. The goats had to be brought into the barn at night. Gerald was indignant about sharing his space with Harriet and Bess, and made his feelings known with the full range of a mule's communicative abilities. Clara mediated between them with the patient exhaustion of a woman who has learned that the animals in her care have feelings about things, and those feelings must be managed. Christmas came, and Clara made me a cloth doll with button eyes and yellow yarn hair, working on it in the evenings after me was asleep, her fingers numb with cold despite the fire. She found a penny candy cane at the general store and put it in me's stocking. They ate roast chicken for Christmas dinner, one of the older hens who had stopped producing, and Clara let me have a small piece of the fruitcake she had made in November, and me declared it the best dinner she had ever eaten, which was not a very long list of dinners, but was still the most purely generous compliment Clara received that year. January of 1879 was when Clara's well pump finally gave out completely. It went on a Tuesday morning, a crack and a grinding sound and then nothing, and Clara stared at it for a long moment and then went into the house and sat at her table and put her head in her hands. Not to cry. She was not crying. She was simply giving herself one full minute to feel the weight of the thing before she picked it up and carried it forward. The creek was frozen. She could break the ice and haul water from the creek, which she began doing that very day, and it was possible, but it was hard, and the ice was thick and getting thicker as January wore on. She could ask the Hendersons for help, and she would if she had to, but they had their own winter struggles and 6 children to feed. She could try to fix the pump herself, which she had done once before with Reverend Davies' help, but Davies had gone to visit his sister in Missouri for the winter and was not expected back until March. She thought about the man on the bay horse. She did not know why she thought about him specifically. Perhaps because he was the most recurring human presence in her daily landscape. Perhaps because she had spent a year watching him and knew, in the particular way you know someone you have only observed and never spoken to, that he was competent. You could read competence in the way a person sat in a saddle, in the way they handled their animal, in the small daily evidence of a person who knew what they were doing and did it without fuss. She did not flag him down. The winter mornings were dark, and she was busy with the ice breaking and the water hauling and everything else, and by the time she was at a place where she might be visible from the trail he had usually already passed. February brought a blizzard that kept her inside for 4 days, and when it was over she dug herself and me and the animals out of 1.5 feet of snow, with the grim efficiency of someone who has learned that the world does not stop being worked just because it is buried in white. The creek was passable again once she broke through the new ice. The pump stayed broken, she adapted, but she was tired. She was tired in the way that accumulates slowly, the way a river cuts stone, a little more depth with every passing day, until one morning you look and realize the canyon is very deep, and you have no clear memory of it being otherwise. March came, and with it the first loosening of winter, a few days of thin, warm sunlight that turned the snow to mud and made Gerald briefly cheerful before the cold returned for another 2 weeks in the way it does in Kansas, as if winter is not ready to admit it is losing. Clara's hands were rough and cracked from the cold water work. She had a persistent ache in her right shoulder from the ice breaking and water hauling. She kept going. She was very good at keeping going. Reverend Davies returned in the 2nd week of March, full of descriptions of his sister's cozy house in Missouri, and came to look at the pump with the genuine goodwill and limited expertise that had always characterized his mechanical assistants. Together they got the pump working well enough to produce water, though Clara thought it was a temporary solution and Davies agreed, but pointed out that temporary solutions had a long tradition of becoming permanent ones, which was not exactly comforting but was not exactly wrong either. April came again. The one-year mark arrived on a morning that was soft and new, the kind of April morning that makes you believe spring is not merely a season but a promise being kept. The air smelled of turned earth and the pale green of new grass was beginning at the edges of things, tender and tentative. Clara was in her kitchen garden when she heard him coming, the familiar rhythm of the bay horse's hooves on the trail, and she straightened from where she had been crouching to examine the soil condition, and she looked toward the trail. He was going to ride past, as he always did, as he had done for 365 days. She watched him approach, the same dark hat, the bay horse moving with its usual easy rhythm, the man himself sitting straight and easy in the saddle. She was aware that she had been watching this particular man for an entire year and did not know his name. She was aware that she had been standing in that invisible space between noticing and being noticed for all of those months, and that the space had somehow become comfortable and familiar, and that she was not sure she wanted it to change and also desperately wanted it to change. The horse slowed. Clara's breath caught. The bay horse, which had never in 365 mornings deviated from its steady trot past her farm, slowed to a walk, and then to a stop. Right at the gap in the fence line where the old gate post stood, the one Thomas had put in and that Clara had always meant to hang a proper gate on and had never gotten around to. Right there. The horse stopped, and the man sat on it for a moment looking at her. He had dark eyes. She could see that now that he was close enough. Dark eyes under the brim of that dark hat, and a face that was weathered and honest, with the particular kind of lines in it that come from squinting into the sun over long distances for many years. He was younger than those lines might suggest. She thought he was probably around 30, maybe 31. He had a jaw that was strong without being aggressive about it, and a mouth that looked like it did not smile without good reason but probably smiled well when it did. He dismounted. He tied the bay horse loosely to the fence post with the practiced ease of a man who has tied horses to fence posts 10,000 times. He took his hat off and held it in his hands, and he looked at her across the short distance of the yard. "I apologize for not having done this sooner," he said. His voice was unhurried and moderate in volume, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. "My name is Eli Calloway. I work the Aldridge Ranch. I have ridden past your farm every morning for a year, and it has been rude of me not to introduce myself, and I cannot think of a good reason why I waited this long, except that I am not always as brave as I believe myself to be." Clara stared at him. She had rehearsed this moment in the private theater of her imagination approximately 800 times, and in not one of those rehearsals had he opened with an apology and a confession of cowardice. She found that she liked it very much. "Clara Whitfield," she said. She crossed the yard to the gap in the fence. She did not have her good dress on. She had dirt on her hands, and her hair was pinned up in the practical way she pinned it for working, not the careful way she might have pinned it for company. She decided this was probably appropriate. He was meeting her in her real life, not in a polished version of it. She stopped at the fence gap. He was 2 or 3 feet away. His hat was still in his hands, turning slowly as he held it, the unconscious fidgeting of a man who was managing nerves with his hands. "I know your name," he said. "Mrs. Whitfield. I asked at the general store in November who had the farm with the corn field and the 2 white goats." "You asked about me in November," Clara said. "I asked about the farm," he said, then paused, and the honesty in his face was very plain. "I asked about you." Me appeared in the doorway of the house at this point, observed the situation with the complete attention of a 5-year-old, and called out, "Mama, is that the horse man?" Clara closed her eyes briefly. "That is my daughter, Me," she said, opening them again. Eli Calloway looked toward the house, and something in his expression shifted, becoming softer, more careful in the way people become careful when they see something that matters. She is very direct, he said. She takes after her father in that respect, Clara said, and then heard what she had said and felt the small, familiar pang of it, but it was a pang without an edge anymore, the way grief eventually becomes when you have carried it long enough. I was sorry to hear about your husband, Eli said quietly. I heard about it when I came to work for Aldridge. I am sorry. Thank you, Clara said and meant it, the way you mean it when someone says it and you can tell they actually are. They stood there for a moment in the April morning, with the sun coming over the flat land, and the goats making their opinions known somewhere behind the barn, and Gerald, standing near the fence looking at the bay horse, with the evaluating expression mules have about other horses. "Would you like some coffee?" Clara heard herself ask. He looked at her with those dark eyes, and she could see the consideration passing through them, the calculation of what this meant and did not mean, the careful weighing of an offer and what it was right to make of it. "I would like that very much," he said, "if it is not an imposition." "I would not have offered if it was," she said, and turned toward the house. She heard him tie the horse properly and follow her through the gate. Me had already retreated from the doorway by the time they reached the house, having apparently accomplished her objective of observing and assessing. Clara found her in the kitchen, standing on her stepping stool at the counter with the authority of someone who lives there and knows it. "This is Mr. Calloway," Clara said. "He works at the Aldridge Ranch." "I know," Me said. "He rides the brown horse." "Bay," Eli said. Me looked at him. "What?" "The horse. He is called a bay. It is a reddish-brown color with a black mane and tail. It is called bay." Me considered this information with the seriousness she brought to all new knowledge. "Bay," she repeated. "What is his name?" "Copper," Eli said. Me nodded, apparently satisfied. She stepped down from her stool and went to the table and sat down in her chair, positioning herself to watch this development with the full attention it deserved. Clara made coffee, which she could do with confidence, and set out the tin mugs and the small pitcher of condensed milk that was a luxury she allowed herself. Eli sat across from me at the table, his hat on his knee, and me immediately asked him 4 consecutive questions about Copper, which Eli answered with the same straight, simple honesty he had brought to everything else, not talking down to her and not talking past her, just answering. Clara listened while she worked at the stove and felt something happening in the room that she had not expected to feel, something warm and tentative and very new, like the green at the edges of things in the April morning. He stayed for 40 minutes. He told her he came to Grover's Creek every morning to collect the ranch post from the store, where the mail stage dropped it 3 times a week, and that he had been doing this run since his first week at the Aldridge Ranch because Aldridge trusted him with it, and because he did not mind the solitary ride. He told her he had grown up in South Texas near the town of Laredo, the second son of a horse rancher, who had taught him everything worth knowing about horses before dying young of a bad heart, which was a family trait on his father's side that Eli had decided not to be afraid of. Clara told him about the broken pump and the winter and the ice hauling from the creek, not to complain, but because he asked how she had managed the winter, and she answered honestly. And she noticed that he listened the way that certain people listen, which is to say, he did not interject with advice while she was still talking but waited until she was finished, and then asked one careful question about whether the pump was properly fixed now or patchwork fixed. And when she said patchwork fixed, he said he would come look at it if she was willing, and see if he could make it properly fixed. He came back 2 days later on his way back in the afternoon, and he spent an hour on the pump with a set of tools he had brought in his saddlebag. He was good at it. He worked with the efficient quietness of a person who is in their element, not rushed and not showy, just doing the thing the right way. The pump worked properly when he was done, with a smooth draw and a strong flow that it had not had since the previous summer. Clara made supper. She had not planned to make supper, or perhaps she could not quite say, because she had started the stew earlier than usual for reasons she had not examined carefully. He accepted the invitation with the same direct simplicity with which she had made it, neither overeager nor falsely reluctant, and he sat at her table and had supper with her and me, and afterward washed his own bowl without being asked. Me asked him to tell her about Texas before she went to bed. He told her about the Rio Grande and the way the mesquite trees grew and the sound that coyotes made on a still night, and me listened with the focused attention she reserved for things she found genuinely interesting, her dark eyes wide, and eventually fell asleep at the table, which she sometimes did when she was supposed to be listening, but the listening had been too comfortable, and her small body had made the decision for her. Eli looked at the sleeping child with an expression that Clara saw and recognized and felt move through her like something important. She carried me to bed. When she came back to the kitchen, Eli was standing near the door, hat in hand, ready to leave. It was the right time to leave. It had been a long enough stay for a first visit. Clara knew this and appreciated it, though she also noticed, with the honesty she tried to apply to herself, that she did not want him to go. "Thank you for the pump," she said. "Thank you for the supper," he said. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Clara," she said. He looked at her. "Clara," he said, and put his hat on and went out into the April dark. He stopping. Every morning he slowed at the gap in the fence, and if Clara was in the yard, he raised his hand in the way men raise their hands in greeting when they are on horseback, and sometimes she raised hers back, and sometimes she simply looked up, and their eyes met across the distance, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was actually a remarkable amount of something contained in a very simple exchange. He came on Sunday afternoons when his work at the ranch allowed it, which was not every Sunday, but enough Sundays that Clara began to look forward to them, the way you look forward to something that has become important before you have fully admitted to yourself that it has become important. He helped with things around the farm, not in a way that suggested she could not manage them herself, but in the way that a person who is good with their hands finds it natural to use those hands for whatever needs doing. He fixed the fence along the north side where 2 posts had rotted at the base. He found the problem with Gerald's harness that had been causing the mule to walk unevenly, and adjusted it so that Gerald moved with a more contented dignity. He rebuilt the latch on the barn door so that it did not blow open in the wind anymore. Clara cooked. She taught me her letters in the evenings by lamplight using a primer she had brought from Ohio, and on the Sundays when Eli came, me would sometimes show him her progress with the alphabet in the slightly formal way she had developed for displaying accomplishments she was proud of, and Eli would look at each letter with the gravity the occasion demanded. In May, a traveling photographer came through Grover's Creek and set up his equipment in the main street for 2 days, a service that Clara had seen mentioned in the county newspaper but had assumed was beyond her practical budget. Eli had heard about it too, and he rode into town on the Saturday the photographer was there, and he asked Clara, carefully and directly, whether she might want a photograph taken of herself and me. He offered to pay for it, which Clara declined firmly, because she had the money and she wanted the photograph, and she was glad he had mentioned it, and that was enough. She and me went on the Saturday, dressed in their best things, and Clara sat very straight in the photographer's chair with me standing beside her, and me gripped the arm of the chair with complete conviction and stared into the camera with the focused intensity she brought to all confrontations, and the photograph that came out was, Clara thought, the most accurate picture of the 2 of them that could possibly have been taken. She kept it on the mantel above the fireplace, where she could see it from her chair at the table. When Eli saw it there one Sunday afternoon, he stood and looked at it for a long, quiet moment and said, "That is a very good photograph." And Clara said, "I think so too." And they stood near each other at the mantel looking at it, and the nearness of him was something she had become accustomed to and also never completely accustomed to. The way you can be both familiar with warmth and still feel it every time. June arrived, and with it the full heat and the long days that lasted until past 9 in the evening, and the farm was busy in the way farms are busy in early summer, All the work of the growing season compressed into hours that never felt quite long enough. Clara was in the cornfield on a Thursday morning when she heard Copper's hooves slow and stop at the fence, and she looked up and shaded her eyes against the sun. Eli said, "I need to tell you something." His tone was level, but there was something underneath it that made her put down the tool she was holding and walk to the fence. She had learned his voice over the weeks and months, the range of it, and this particular note was new. "Edmund Aldridge died 4 days ago," he said. "Heart failure." Clara felt the news settle. She had not known Aldridge well, but she knew what Aldridge dying meant for the people who worked his land. "I am sorry to hear it," she said. "What happens to the ranch?" "His son Robert inherits," Eli said. "Robert Aldridge." He paused. "Robert is a different kind of man from his father." She looked at him. "What kind?" "The kind who does not see much reason to keep on the same people his father trusted," Eli said. He was being careful with his words, choosing them with the deliberateness she had come to know meant he was dealing with something difficult. "He has already let 3 men go. I expect I will be among the next." "Do you have work lined up?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I thought you should know, in case it affects my Sundays." She understood what he was saying and what he was not saying. "Where would you go?" she asked. The question came out more bluntly than she had intended, which was sometimes what happened when a feeling she had been not quite examining was suddenly required to speak. He held her gaze. "I would rather not go far," he said. The heat was considerable, and the sun was bright, and her hands were dirty from the cornfield. And me was somewhere behind the barn, probably having a conversation with Gerald about something. And Clara stood at the fence with her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and looked at Eli Calloway, who had ridden past her farm every day for a year, and had finally stopped and introduced himself, and turned out to be, in the quiet accumulating way of real things, entirely essential. "There is work here," she said, "if you wanted it." His eyes changed. "I would not want to impose. You have been fixing my fence and my pump and my barn latch and my mule's harness," she said. "That is not what I call imposing. That is what I call useful." Something moved across his face, careful and warm and questioning. "Is that all it is?" he asked. "No," she said. "That is not all it is." He was let go from the Aldridge Ranch by Robert Aldridge at the end of June, along with 2 other men, with 2 weeks' pay and a handshake that Robert apparently delivered with the brisk efficiency of a man who considered human beings primarily in terms of their cost. Eli told Clara this on the Sunday after it happened, sitting at her table with his coffee, and she listened and then said, "Then it is time to talk about arrangements." And Eli said, "What kind of arrangements?" And Clara said, "Practical ones to begin with." And they sat together at the table and talked about what working her farm would look like and what it could eventually become with 2 people running it instead of 1. She had thought about it. She was honest about that. She had done the arithmetic of her land and her resources and her needs, and she had thought about what was realistic and what was possible, and she told him all of this with the directness that had always been her natural mode of operation. He listened the same way, carefully and fully, and then he asked several good questions about the soil quality in the North Field and the water access and the grazing capacity, questions that told her he had also been thinking about it, which she found she was glad to know. He moved into the small spare room in the barn. This was the proper thing. This was what the neighbors would expect, and what the town of Grover's Creek would accept. Because 1879 Kansas had rules about what a widow woman did with a man, and the rules were enforced mostly through talk, which Clara did not care about in principle but cared about in practice, because her reputation affected her ability to do business in Grover's Creek, and her ability to do business in Grover's Creek affected her ability to feed her daughter. So the spare room in the barn, which Eli made comfortable with a cot and a small iron stove and his own few possessions, which were not many because he was the kind of man who had spent enough years moving that he had learned not to accumulate more than he could carry. He was a good worker. She had suspected this and was confirmed in it within the first week. He was up before dawn and working by first light, and he had the particular quality of industry that requires no management or supervision, the simple fact of seeing what needs doing and doing it. The north field that Clara had been fighting to cultivate properly for 2 years turned out to respond well to the additional drainage work he did in July, cutting small channels in the low areas where water pooled after rain. The yield from the field that summer was the best she had had. Me adored him. This happened gradually and then completely, the way most things happen with small children. She had accepted his presence from the beginning, in the matter-of-fact way that children accept things they have been given time to observe first. But by July, she was following him around the farm in the mornings while he worked, asking questions in the relentless way she had, and Eli answered every one of them with the patient seriousness that me required. And in the afternoons when the heat was too heavy for outdoor work, he sat with me on the porch and let her teach him her letters, which she did with the severity of a 5-year-old who takes her responsibilities as educator extremely seriously. Clara watched this from the kitchen window and felt things she had not felt in a long time. Felt them fully and without apology. August arrived, and one evening after supper, when me was in bed and the house was quiet and Clara and Eli were sitting on the porch in the cooling air watching the last of the light leave the sky, Eli said, "I need to ask you something." Clara looked at him sideways. He was looking at the sky, which was going from orange to deep blue to almost black at the top, a color gradient that Kansas did better than any place she had ever seen. "Ask," she said. He turned to look at her. He had taken his hat off, and his dark hair was slightly unruly from the day's work, and he looked very much like himself, which was the best way she knew to describe him. He looked like himself in all the ways that mattered. "I do not want to be only your hired hand," he said. "I want to say that plainly. I have been careful not to push on anything you were not ready for because you have had enough of people and circumstances pushing on you, and I did not want to be another thing you had to manage, but I think you should know what I want." "What do you want?" she asked, though she knew she had known for a good while. "I want to be here," he said, "not in the barn. Not as hired help. I want to be here in the right way, with you, if you will have me." The stars were starting to come out, the first few of them, the brave ones that did not wait for full dark. Clara looked at them and breathed the warm evening air and thought about Thomas, whom she had loved and mourned and would always carry. She thought about the year of mornings watching a figure on a bay horse ride past and never stop. She thought about the moment he had stepped off that horse and walked to her fence and said he was not as brave as he believed himself to be, which had turned out to be his way of being very brave indeed. "I will have you," she said. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on her knee, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat on the porch in the August dark and held on to each other, and the stars came out one by one until the whole Kansas sky was lit with them. He asked her properly one Sunday morning in September, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands exactly as he had stood on that April morning when he first introduced himself, which she later told him was either very sentimental or very unimaginative, and he said probably both. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band that he had kept in the bottom of his saddlebag for 7 years, and that he held out to her in his palm with the directness that had always been the thing about him she trusted most. She said yes before he had finished asking. She told him this was not impatience, it was efficiency. He said he would take either. They were married in October by Reverend Davies, who managed the occasion with considerably more grace than he managed pump repairs, in the small white church in Grover's Creek on a morning that was cold and bright and very clear. The sky that particular deep Kansas blue that appeared only in autumn and only on the best days. Mrs. Eliza Porter was there, and the Hendersons, and a few other people from the county who had known Clara through her years of managing alone, and who came to wish her well with the genuine warmth of a small community that could be aggravating in its attention, and was sometimes capable of being purely kind. 2 men from the Aldridge Ranch came, former colleagues of Eli's who brought a practical wedding gift of seed stock and a bottle of Tennessee whiskey, which Eli accepted with the handshakes and the contained pleasure of a man who is very happy and has not quite found the limit of how happy he is permitted to be. Me wore a white dress with a blue sash that Mrs. Porter had helped Clara make, and she held Eli's hand during the ceremony with a gravity that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and approved of all of it. And when Davy said the part about the rings, me watched with huge dark eyes, and when it was over she said very seriously, "Now you live in the house." And Eli said, "Yes, I do." And me nodded as if this had been her plan all along, which Clara thought it probably had been. The rest of the afternoon was the kind of celebration that a rural Kansas community in 1879 could put together on short notice and limited resources, but genuine goodwill, which meant a lot of food and some fiddle music from a Henderson boy who turned out to be quite good, and several hours of the specific pleasure of being in a room with people who are honestly glad for you. That night, after me was asleep and the house was quiet and the October wind moved around the corners as it always did, Clara sat in her kitchen, which was their kitchen now, and Eli came and sat across from her, and they looked at each other across the table as people who have arrived somewhere important look at each other. "We are going to be all right," he said. "We have been all right," she said. "We are going to be better than all right." He reached across the table and she took his hand. Winter came again, as it always did, but this winter the cold was something they managed together, and there is an enormous difference between managing something alone and managing it alongside someone who is pulling in the same direction. The water hauling was shared. The wood splitting was shared. The long evenings were not quiet in the way loneliness makes evenings quiet. They were quiet in the full way, the way evenings are when the people in a house are content enough not to need to fill every moment with sound. Eli taught Clara more about horses than she had known before, which was not much, because her experience had been mostly with mules, specifically with Gerald, who was a limited sample. They rode together sometimes on Sundays when the weather allowed, Eli on Copper and Clara on a mare they had purchased from a neighboring farmer at a price they could afford if they were careful, a gray horse they named Rosie after Clara's grandmother, which Eli accepted without comment and which me found absolutely appropriate. He told her about his life before Kansas. He told her about the trail drives he had been on, cattle moving north through Texas and into Kansas in the years when the trails were still busy with the great cattle commerce of the post-war years. He told her about the men he had ridden with, some good and some otherwise, the way any long experience of the world produces a mixed company. He told her about the time he had been shot at by a man in Dodge City who had confused him with someone else, and the bullet had gone through the brim of his hat, and he had stood very still and been remarkably calm for someone who had nearly died by misidentification, which was how he had learned that his nerves were more reliable under pressure than in ordinary social situations, a fact which explained, he said, why he had ridden past her farm for a year without stopping. Clara laughed at this. She laughed the way she had not laughed in a very long time, freely and without calculating whether it was appropriate, and Eli watched her laugh with an expression that she had come to know was one of his most honest expressions, a look of pure, undefended warmth that he wore when he did not know he was wearing it. She told him things too. She told him about Thomas, not just the facts she had already shared, but the texture of it, the way grief for a person you have loved is complicated by all the things that were complicated in the living, which in any marriage includes some things that are complicated. She told him that Thomas had been good but sometimes hard to reach, a man who expressed love primarily through provision rather than words, which was a valid form of expression and had not been enough on its own, and she had loved him truly and had sometimes also been lonely inside the marriage in ways she had not let herself examine while he was alive. She told Eli this carefully, with the awareness that it was a true thing and also a private thing, and she was choosing to share it because it mattered to be fully honest with the person you were choosing to build a life with. Eli listened without judgment and then said, "I am sorry you were lonely." In the simple, direct way he said important things, and she felt that the longest part of the loneliness was behind her. Spring came again. The wheat they had planted the previous fall was coming in well. The corn that they planned together, working out the rotation in conversations at the kitchen table over coffee, was in the ground and growing. The farm was not wealthy, but it was genuinely viable in a way it had not been before, because two sets of capable hands and two thinking minds, applied to the same set of problems, produce results that are more than double what one alone can achieve. Clara discovered she was carrying their child in April, which was a fact she greeted with a complicated joy, because she was 30 years old and she knew what childbearing required of a body, and she had done it once, and she did not underestimate it. But the joy was real, underneath the seriousness of it, the deep glad thing of a life being made by people who were making it deliberately, with full knowledge and full wanting. She told Eli in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning over coffee, because important things in their life seemed to happen at that kitchen table, and he sat very still for a moment, and then he got up and came to her and held her face in his hands, which were large and were roughened and very gentle, and he said, "Clara," and she said, "I know." And they held each other for a long time in the spring morning, with the sound of the farm around them, and Me's voice coming from outside, where she was telling Gerald something at length. Me received the news of a coming sibling with the focused analytical consideration she brought to all major developments, asked 3 pointed questions about where the baby would sleep, and whether the baby would be interested in the things Me was interested in, and whether the baby would take Clara's attention away from her. These were honest and important questions. Clara answered them honestly and completely, and Eli added that in his experience, new babies were not very interesting for the first several months, which was a fact Me found reassuring. The summer of 1880 was a good one by Kansas standards, which meant it was hot and occasionally brutal, but the rain came at mostly the right times, and the crops were not the disaster they sometimes were. Clara continued working through June and into July, adjusting to the increasing slowness and awkwardness of her body with the practicality she applied to all things, handing off the heavier work to Eli without drama, and taking up the things she could do from a chair or a standing position without strain. Me was 6 now and had started attending the school in Grover's Creek that had opened the previous year, a one-room building with a young schoolteacher named Miss Hartley who was from Chicago and found Kansas alternately fascinating and alarming. Me took to school with the intensity she took to everything. She came home full of new information and opinions every afternoon, which she shared comprehensively with Eli during the after-supper time, while Clara did the dishes and listened to them from the other side of the kitchen. The boy was born in the first week of August. He arrived in the early hours of the morning with the help of Mrs. Henderson, who turned out to be an excellent midwife, as she had delivered her own 6 children with nobody's help, and had strong views about the subject. Eli waited in the kitchen for 4 hours of the worst patience of his life, which he spent in absolute stillness at the kitchen table, in a way that Mrs. Henderson later told Clara she had never seen a man manage before. When he heard the baby cry, he put his head in his hands and breathed for a long moment before he could stand up. Clara was exhausted and entirely herself, which Eli came to her and told her, holding her hand and looking at her with the open, undisguised feeling that he had always worn when he did not know he was wearing it, that she was entirely herself and entirely extraordinary. She told him he was being dramatic. He said he was allowed. The boy was healthy and loud and had Clara's coloring, fair with reddish tints in the slight dark of his newborn hair, and Eli held him with the carefully arranged arms of a man who has decided he is going to do this correctly and is concentrating very hard. The baby regarded Eli with the unfocused ancient look of the newborn, and Eli looked back with an expression that was pure and entirely undone, in the best way Clara had ever seen. They named him James Thomas Calloway, Thomas for the man who had loved this land first and James for Eli's father, and neither of them felt the need to explain at length why they had chosen what they had chosen because between them, the explanation was not needed. Me came to see him in the morning, approaching the cradle with the careful solemnity of the very small confronting the very new. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "He is very red." "He will become less red," Clara said. "All right," me said, and touched his hand with one careful finger, and James curled his tiny fingers around hers with the automatic grip that newborns have, and me looked at this for a moment, and then looked up with an expression that Clara recognized as the look me wore when something had surprised her into feeling something she had not planned to feel. "He is holding my hand," me said. "He is," Clara said. Me looked back at her brother and something settled in her face, a decision being made. "That is good," she said. "The farm grew. This is not a quick or dramatic thing, but it is a real thing. The way that consistent work and consistent care and consistent attention produce over time something that you could not have predicted from any one day's looking, but that becomes undeniable when you look back at the distance you have traveled. By 1882, they had expanded into the North Field properly. By 1883, they had a small cattle operation of their own, 12 head to start, nothing like the Aldridge operation, but real and growing. Robert Aldridge had sold the Aldridge Ranch 2 years after inheriting it to a land company from Chicago, which was what the county had expected of him, and the large Aldridge spread was now parceled differently, and the landscape had changed in the way landscapes in Kansas changed, continuously and without sentiment. Eli was good with the cattle in the way he was good with all animals, and the small herd thrived under his management. Clara kept the books and managed the crop rotation, and maintained the correspondence with the buyers in Grover's Creek and the county seat that kept their commercial relationship solid. They were a partnership in the full sense of the word, two people operating together in the complementary way that makes two whole people into something greater than the sum of their individual capable selves. Me at 8 was ferocious about her education in the way she was ferocious about all her interests, and Miss Hartley, who had decided after 2 years that Kansas was primarily fascinating, had told Clara that me was the most intellectually motivated student she had taught, which Clara received with the pride of a mother who had poured her best efforts into that child since before the child was born. James grew from his red newborn self into a solid, cheerful boy who had Eli's dark eyes and Clara's fair skin, and a temperament that was, mercifully, easy in a way that made everyone around him slightly more relaxed just by being near him. He followed Eli around the farm in the mornings the way me had once followed Eli around asking questions, and Eli moved through the morning chores with this small shadow at his heels and showed him everything with the same patient seriousness he had given me. One morning in the spring of 1883, Clara was standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, and she watched Eli outside in the yard, showing James how to approach a horse properly, how to let the horse smell your hand first, and take its time deciding about you. Eli was crouched down to James's height, talking quietly, his hand on the boy's shoulder, and James was watching Copper with the focused, careful attention of a child who understands that he is being given something important. Clara stood at the window and felt the specific fullness of a life that has come to be much more than you dared hope for. She had a husband who loved her with the same directness and consistency with which he did everything, who had never once made her feel like a problem to be managed or a circumstance to be navigated, who had sat on a bay horse and ridden past her farm for an entire year, and then one April morning stopped and taken his hat off and told her he was not always as brave as he believed himself to be. She had 2 children, me who was 8 and brilliant and already making plans for a life that would be large and deliberate, and James who was 2 and had his father's eyes and the sunny, undemanding nature that was his own particular gift to the family. She had 40 acres that were producing. She had a farm that was alive in all the ways farms need to be alive: the soil and the animals and the growing things and the people working it. She had this kitchen, this table, these windows, this land. She set down her coffee and went outside. Eli looked up when she appeared in the yard, the way he always looked up, with the immediate attention that had never become something she took for granted because it was never something he withheld. James looked up too, copying his father in the unself-conscious way small children copy the people they most admire. "Show him again," Clara said, coming to stand beside them at Copper's head. "I want to watch." Eli looked at her with those dark eyes that had always seemed to see her clearly, that had seen her across the distance of that trail for an entire year before either of them had known what to make of it. He smiled, which he did with good reason and always well, and he took James's small hand in his large one and said, "All right, let us do it again." She stood in the spring morning and watched her husband teach their son about horses, and felt the warm, solid fact of everything that had led to this morning: the grief and the work and the stubborn refusal to stop, and the year of watching a man ride past, and the April day he finally stopped, and everything that had grown from that stopping, slow and steady and real as the wheat coming up in the north field. That evening at supper, Mie announced that she intended to become a school teacher, or possibly a lawyer. She had not decided yet, and Eli said both seemed entirely within reach to him, and Mie regarded him with the evaluating look she wore when she was deciding whether a person's opinion was worth having and determined that it was, and Clara looked at this scene. Her daughter and her husband and her son, who had fallen asleep in his chair, because supper had been a long time coming and he had decided not to wait for it, and thought that Thomas had been right about this land. He had been right that it was worth believing in. She was glad she had stayed. She was glad for all of it, for the blistered hands and the broken pump and the winter and the drought, and the year of mornings watching a dark figure on a bay horse ride past without stopping. She was glad for all of it because it had all been the road to this kitchen table, this lamplight, this man, these children. The autumn of 1883 brought good news from the county seat. A new road was going to be built a half-mile north of their property, connecting Grover's Creek more directly to the county seat, which would make commerce easier and bring more traffic through the area, and the county land assessor, a practical man named Beaumont who had been to the farm twice and always complimented the condition of the fields, told Eli that their land value had increased significantly and would likely continue to do so as the area developed. This was not a small thing. In 1879, when Clara had done her arithmetic by lamplight and the numbers had been frightening, a land value increase had not been in any version of the future she had been able to imagine. She and Eli sat at the kitchen table the evening after Beaumont's visit and looked at the numbers together, the actual figures on actual paper, and Clara felt a very specific feeling that she had not felt often enough to have a ready word for, which was the feeling of being genuinely and specifically safe, not the temporary safety of a good harvest or a fixed pump, but the deeper safety of a life that has become stable enough to build from. She wrote to her sister in Ohio. She had written before, short letters about practical matters, but this letter was longer. She told her sister about the farm and the crops and Eli, whom she had mentioned in previous letters in the brief way. She mentioned important things when she was not quite ready to examine them fully. She told her sister about me and James, and the way the cottonwoods along the creek turned gold in October, and how the Kansas sky had more room in it than any sky she had seen anywhere else. She told her sister that she was happy, which was a word she used carefully because she had learned that happiness is not a permanent state but a recurring one, and you honor it by noticing it when it is there rather than by demanding it stay. Her sister came for a visit in the spring of 1884, which was both wonderful and chaotic in the way that visits from people you love but have not seen in years always are. Her sister's name was Ruth, and she was 2 years older than Clara, and had the particular manner of an older sister, who believes, affectionately and incorrectly, that she has superior perspective on all situations. Ruth arrived on the stage from the county seat on a Tuesday, and spent the first afternoon surveying the farm with the expression of someone who had expected worse, but was revising upward steadily. She met Eli on the Wednesday morning, and spent about 20 minutes talking to him about the farm and the cattle and his background, which Clara recognized as an interrogation delivered with enough social grace that most people would not have called it that. Eli received it with the unruffled directness that was his natural response to most things, answered all of Ruth's questions, asked a few of his own about Ohio that were genuinely interested rather than defensive, and by the end of the conversation Ruth had decided, Clara could see, that her opinion was positive. She told Clara this on Thursday while they were doing the washing together behind the house, the way women tell each other important things, sideways and while doing something else. "He is a good man," Ruth said. "I know," Clara said. "He looks at you like you are remarkable," Ruth said. "He is biased," Clara said. "He is correct," Ruth said, and wrung out a piece of linen with a firmness that suggested the subject was closed and settled. Ruth stayed for 2 weeks and then returned to Ohio carrying a jar of Clara's gooseberry preserves and a letter for their mother and a promise to come again in 2 years, which she kept. James turned 4 in the summer of 1884 and received a pony from his parents, a small gray animal that me immediately named Buttons over James's strong objection that this was not a dignified name for a horse. Eli ruled diplomatically that the pony's official name would be something James could choose when he was a little older, and that Buttons could serve in the meantime, which satisfied nobody entirely, and therefore was probably fair. James took to riding with the same natural ease that Eli had, which was a joy to watch. A small boy on a small gray pony following his father across the farm on a morning with the early light on the wheat, and the sound of the cattle in the north field and all of it, exactly as it should be. Me started teaching James his letters in the evenings, having decided that Miss Hartley's methods were sound but could be supplemented. She was a firm and excellent instructor who took no nonsense and accepted no sloppy penmanship. James, who was 4 and had the sunny nature that made him willing to accept almost anything from me, learned his letters with impressive speed, and told Eli that me had said his A was the best A she had ever seen from a 4-year-old, which was high praise indeed, and which Eli received with appropriate gravity. Clara found in 1885 that she was expecting again, which she received this time with the pleasure of a woman who has done this before and knows what she is getting into and wants it anyway. She told Eli at the kitchen table over coffee, which was where they told each other things, and Eli took her hand across the table and said, "Good," in the way he said important things, simply and fully meaning them. The second child was a girl. She arrived in the February of 1886, which was not the best time for arriving in Kansas, but was the time she chose. And she was healthy and small, and had Eli's dark eyes and a head of black hair that made everyone who saw her say she was going to be striking when she grew up, which was a prediction that, even in her first few hours, seemed likely to be correct. They named her Eli Calloway, Eli after no one in particular, but because both Clara and Eli found it a name that sounded like something a person could do anything with, and Anne after Clara's mother. Me, at 11, received Eli with the combination of authority and tenderness that characterized her approach to all things she considered important. She held the baby with the careful arms of a big sister who has been waiting for this role and found, when it arrived, that she was entirely prepared for it. James, who was 5, was interested in Eli for about 20 minutes and then wanted to go outside, which Clara felt was entirely honest and acceptable. By the spring of 1886, the farm had 16 head of cattle and the north and south fields both under cultivation with a rotation system that Eli had researched and Clara had planned, and which was producing yields that were among the better ones in the county. The general store in Grover's Creek had a standing order for Clara's preserved goods, the gooseberry and apple and peach that she put up in the late summer, which had become a small but reliable income supplement. The farmhouse had been expanded, a room added to the back with the help of the Henderson boys who were grown now and hired out their labor in the neighborhood, so that each child had their own space and Clara and Eli had room enough to breathe. One evening in the May of 1886, with Alina sleeping in the cradle near the fireplace and me reading at the table and James presumably asleep, but possibly negotiating with Gerald through the barn wall, Clara and Eli sat on the porch again as they had sat on many evenings, and the air was warm and full of the smell of the season, and the sky was doing its Kansas thing of being impossibly wide. "I have been thinking," Eli said. "You are always thinking," Clara said. "What is it this time?" "I want to get a bull," he said, "to build the herd properly, not buy full-grown cattle one or two at a time, a good registered bull and build from there." She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon, which he did when he was working through an idea, his profile clear and familiar and so entirely her home that she could not remember the exact texture of the loneliness of before, though she remembered that it had been real. "How much?" she asked. "More than I want it to be," he said. "Tell me the number." He told her. It was a significant number. She sat with it for a moment, running the figures in the way she ran all figures quickly and precisely, because she had always been good at numbers and had become better from necessity. "We could do it," she said, "if we are careful for a year, if we take the Henderson contract for the grazing lease on the east pasture." He turned to look at her. "I thought of the Henderson lease too," he said. "I know," she said. "You had the same expression you had last spring when you were thinking about the drainage channels." He laughed, which he did with the ease of a man who has been happy for long enough that happiness no longer surprises him. "Do I have a thinking expression?" "You have many expressions," she said. "I know all of them." He took her hand. "Yes," he said, "you do." They sat in the warm evening and talked through the numbers and the plan and the practical considerations, and then they talked about other things, smaller things and larger things, the way people talk when they are comfortable and have time and have chosen each other. They talked about me's future, which already seemed to exceed Grover's Creek in its ambitions. They talked about James and whether he would always want to be a rancher, or whether he might go another direction, which it was too early to say but interesting to speculate. They talked about Alina, who was 3 months old and was already doing something with her face when she looked at people that suggested a particular quality of seeing that might, in 15 years, be described as shrewd. "She watches everything," Clara said. "She gets that from you," Eli said. Clara considered this. "From me," she said. "You watched me ride past your farm for a year," he said. "Before you let on you had noticed. If that is not a talent for observation, I do not know what is." She looked at him. "I was not hiding it." "You were not advertising it either," he said. "You were not stopping," she said. "No," he said, "I was not." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know I was not indifferent. Every morning I rode past I was not indifferent." "I know," she said. "I could tell." "How?" he asked. "You slowed," she said. "Not much, just a fraction. Copper's gait would change slightly when we were in front of your property. I do not think you knew you were doing it." He was quiet for a long moment. "I did not know I was doing it," he said. "I know," she said. "That was how I knew it was real." He looked at her with those dark eyes in the dimming light, and she looked back at him across all the distance they had traveled to get here, the year of looking and the year of learning and all the years of building. And the feeling between them was not the sharp, thrilling uncertainty of new love, which they had had and which she remembered clearly, but something larger and steadier and more themselves, the specific deep warmth of two people who know each other fully and have chosen each other anyway, every day. In all the small and large ways that choosing happens. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am very glad I stopped," he said. She tightened her hand in his. "So am I," she said. "So am I. In the house behind them, Eleanor made a small sound in her sleep, the contented sound of a child who is warm and held and entirely unaware that the world is anything other than good. And Mee's voice said something from the kitchen, probably to herself or possibly to the cat they had acquired in 1884, and who had become, against everyone's better judgment, a full member of the household. Gerald made his evening sound from the barn, which was a sound somewhere between a sigh and a complaint, and was fundamentally just Gerald letting everyone know he was still there and had opinions. The stars came out in the way they did in Kansas, abundantly and without hesitation, filling the enormous sky above the flat land with more light than any one evening could reasonably need. And Clara Whitfield Calloway and her husband sat beneath them on the porch of the farm that had been built out of grief and stubbornness and 40 acres, and 2 years of quiet watching and one April morning of a man getting off his horse and taking off his hat and being, finally, brave enough to stop. And everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and everything that needed to be said had been said, or would be said in the mornings to come, at the table over coffee, in the way they had always said the things that mattered most. They stayed on the porch a while longer, listening to the Kansas night, and then they went inside together, into the light and the warmth and the life they had made, and the door closed behind them, and the stars went on being exactly as abundant as they had always been.